Welcome, I'm Denise Graves, and you're watching Opera America's Oral History Project.
Patricia Mitchell, welcome. I'm so happy to speak with you, and thanks for giving us some time today.
Thank you. What fun.
I always start my interviews with a question of who brought you to your first opera?
You know, the public school system in Los Angeles, because there was an organization called the Opera Guild, which funded student performances for students at the intimate Shrine Auditorium, which was filled with like 5th and 6th graders. And in rotating years, you saw The Bard and Bride, The Magic Flute, and Hansel and Gretel.
Wow. What company was performing?
They put it together. Marilyn Horne was in those performances. A lot of students of opera at that time. I mean, that was a long time ago. Took part in these productions. I don't know where they got the rags from, but so those are my first experiences. And some people would say it's amazing you ever had another one. But I remember thinking it was extraordinary.
And that's I like to ask that too. Was your first experience one that made you think, wow, this is pretty neat? Because a lot of people report that their first opera experience was like not a positive experience, and it took them several times before they began to get it.
The first one I saw was The Magic Flute. It still is one of my favorite pieces. And so it got me off to a good start. And I saw subsequently a lot of performances in the Shrine Auditorium of the San Francisco Opera, which toured to LA annually after they closed in San Francisco on Thanksgiving weekend.
When we did our virtual road trip last year during COVID, that's when I really focused on the fact that San Francisco Opera did regularly, and every year, go down to Los Angeles, so that before New York City Opera was going out to LA, San Francisco Opera was kind of the opera provider of Los Angeles. So that was you knew their performances in LA. Right.
I can still see Joan Sutherland in the Traviata, and because it was all the artists from the San Francisco season did it, and they rolled up the scenery. And Eddie Powell, the head of the stagehands union when I was there in San Francisco, said, we could load the whole of the season in one train car. Now, of course, it takes 6 containers for one show, which is part of the reason touring's not so viable anymore, but it was sure viable then.
Yeah. Michael Bronson told us that at the Met, they used to have a special train car that opened at the rear, so that way they could slide all the rolled backdrops into the back of the train.
When I got to San Francisco Opera, which was in 78, they were still using the ground row that they used in the Tosca in 1932 when the War Memorial Opera House opened.
Wow. Wow, that's remarkable. I was going to get to this question later, but you sort of touched on it now. I know that you entered your wonderful career in Minnesota, and that you have had a house in Minnesota for many years. And I sort of thought of you as Minnesotan, but in hearing you now and in doing some research, you are actually from California. So tell me about the California-Minnesota connection.
Well, it's a family story, because my mother's family had a cabin on this lake in northern Minnesota, because, as my grandfather always said, if you're a Swede from Nebraska, you have to go to a place that looks like Sweden, which means you have to have pine trees and birch trees by water. So we always spent our family vacations at the cabin, which became my favorite place, still is.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I know how much you love it, and it always made me think that you're actually Minnesotan, but I guess you get a 50% credit for being Minnesotan given the family home.
I think so. I think so.
So I know that your first job in the arts was at the Guthrie, if I read correctly.
Correct.
I'm kind of curious to know what got you to opera as a job path, as a career?
Really, it is. I got the job at the Guthrie, total serendipity, because I had sort of put out to the face that I wanted to move to Minnesota, because why live 2,000 miles away from my favorite place if I could live 200? And I got the job at the Guthrie, and I left the Guthrie and joined a consulting firm led by a guy named Brad Morrison. It was called Arts Development Associates. Famously wrote a book, In Search of an Audience, about the development of the audience for the Guthrie.
Mhm.
And in the beginning, there were 4 of us, 3 in Minneapolis and 1 based in New York. And all the clients were arts organizations. And we did a lot of work in marketing and audience development. And then in that way that happens when you're in the consulting business, you know, you go how the work goes. So it sort of morphed into long range planning for arts organizations and for state arts agencies, and then it kind of got into feasibility studies for cities and facilities. And the last project I did was a feasibility study for Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick, New Jersey, about the feasibility of a science and technology center in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I thought to myself, after we made the final presentation to the head dogs at Johnson & Johnson, I don't actually give a rip whether there is a science and technology center in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I mean, it was a good project, but feasibility studies just didn't float my boat. So I turned to what is the least feasible enterprise in human affairs, which is opera. Put that out to the cosmos, and there you go.
Wow. Now, in those early years when you were working at the Guthrie, what was the place of Minnesota opera, you know, on its trajectory? Was it still at the Walker Arts Center, or had it separated from the Walker and become its own company?
It was still, when I got there, it was still called Center Opera, I believe. I can't remember when they made the name change, but when I went into the consulting business, they were a client. I mean, I have known Philip Brunel since he was the music director of Center Opera, which is a really long time. Somewhere there's a portrait of him because he looks the same. And I can't remember when they made the name shift. And they performed at the Guthrie, and they performed at the O'Shaughnessy, and I think, and then they settled on what was then called the Cedar Village Theater in the Cedar Riverside, which was close to the university. And by then they were Minnesota Opera, and they did crazy things like The Mother of Us All and Faust, Counter Faust. And they had this wonderful opera that they did, an improvised opera called The Newest Opera in the World. And they had wheels that you spun. So you would spin and it would set on a period for style. And then there was a wheel that they spun for the plot. And then they made one up. They weren't very long, but they were very funny.
Wow. Wow, that's just fabulous, because of course Minnesota Opera began at the Walker Arts Center, you know, as the Center Opera, but always committed to new work, and that DNA has stayed with the company for all of these decades.
Yeah, and now they're very strong and powerful in new work.
Yeah,
it's very exciting to see.
we'll come back to Minnesota in a minute, but so there you go to San Francisco, and what was your position when you started there in 1978?
I was the title was company administrator, which was sort of a general management position, but I also did the labor negotiations. Kurt Herbert Adler was an excellent teacher because I didn't know anything about labor negotiations, but I sure learned. And I did that for when Terry McEwen came, which was in
82.
He made me the executive director, but it was, you know, it's still a nagging worry usually about money job, like I've always had.
So Kurt Adler, legendary, notorious. What was it like working for Kurt Adler?
He was an amazing, amazing man. And although he was not always nice, you couldn't help but adore the guy. Partly because he was so passionate about opera. At the same, I mean, his highest, he used to say, That is impossible. That is impossible. Then his highest compliment was, that is not impossible.
Hmm.
And I was recently watching, somebody posted on good old Facebook, a documentary that was made in his last season. And there are lots of wonderful interviews from Birgit Nielsen and Leontine Price and Luciano and Placido talking about what it was like working with him and how much they loved and admired and feared him. I don't think anybody ever called him anything but Mr. Adler.
And I know stories of people, being fired at midnight, but then hired back again at 8 a.m. and just
Oh,
some
yeah.
of those challenging times with Mr. Adler.
Or he would send out a memo, there wasn't email then, a memo saying, no bill will be paid until I have personally approved it. And that would last about 36 hours, at which point the controller would convince him that really either he had to do nothing but look at bills, or he really had to let the finance department take care of that. And that would be the end of that.
Wow. And how about Terry McEwen? What was it like working for Terry?
Much different. The interesting thing that each of them said about the other was, Adler would say, Terry McEwen knows more about singers than anyone. And McEwen said the same thing about Adler. That it was fascinating to work for him. He was much different, came from a much different background from the record company, from EMI, I think. And he used to say, there was some production that we did and it was wildly well received, and the cast was brilliant. And he said, all my casts are brilliant the first time. If you could just get those people, they'd all be brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of trouble with the frustrations of productions and how it has a life of its own. You can't control it. Even Kurt Adler couldn't control it. But it was fun working for him.
When did you make it then to Los Angeles?
1988. The first season was 88, 89.
So you went from a very established opera company with a legendary track record to a brand new opera company.
Right.
That must have been just a totally different experience to start something from the ground up.
It was. That was the appeal of it, frankly, and the fun. You'll notice that fun comes up quite a bit, but it was fun because San Francisco Opera, I remember when I first got there, I would say to Bob Walker, who was the business manager, why do we do it this way? And he would say, well, we've always done it that way. In Los Angeles, there wasn't any always. I mean, we were making up the ways. And the time when I got there was actually the third season of LA Opera as a producing company. And Peter Hemmings had repeatedly asked me to come there. And finally, I waited till LA Opera was really, really, really in financial trouble. And then I said, sure, why not?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say until you knew that LA Opera was really a strong and going concern, but you finished the sentence a little differently.
Oh, no, we owed so much money when I got there. I mean, I used my own typewriter, right? Sparklets wouldn't come and take the empty water bottles away. Never mind bring us any bottles with water in them. We bought pencils one at a time for cash. We had meetings every day about what to pay.
Wow.
I learned a lot.
And tell us about working with Peter Hemmings.
I just talked to Jane yesterday.
Oh, good.
It was fascinating. He knew so much. He maybe would be in the chain of people who know as much about singers as anyone. And he had a wonderful flair for the theatrical, dramatic part of opera. So those early productions, who does The Fiery Angel, right? Who convinces David Hockney to design Tristan and Isolde? He took brave chances, which did not always pay off.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a very familial feeling around that company, because the whole time I was there, the entire senior staff fit around the round table in his office. It just was not a behemoth organization.
I remember that feeling vividly because I began at Opera America, as you know, 1990, and early on was engaged with Peter Hemmings and would visit from time to time. And you just felt the family feeling, both from the LA Opera League and the enthusiasm after the Olympics to start an opera company in LA. It was and even that feeling continues even today to a certain extent, even as the company has grown and has grown more mature. I always felt that Peter produced with an identifiable intention. And again, as you say, it didn't always work, but you had a sense that it wasn't at all generic. It was all very intentional and by design. Peter is quite remarkable that way.
He was remarkable that way. And that, I think, furthered the sense of family loyalty. I mean, we would have these milestones in the early years of like finally paying off a bank loan. And we'd have a little mortgage burning party. And people had put their personal CDs up behind. I mean, there's no bank was going to give us any credit. And one of our board members, whose husband was a physician, a lawsuit was settled in his favor. And instead of doing the new kitchen that he had promised she could do if this turned out that way, she gave the money to us.
Wow.
Probably kept us open. There was one time at a board meeting, I remember, we couldn't make the workers' comp payment. A board member contributed that.
Wow.
So there was, I think it was such a long fight to establish an opera company. And one of the early board members, Dorothy Foreman, had been on the board of 7 failed opera companies in Los Angeles. 7. And people were just determined this one was going to work.
Was it determination that made this one work? Probably some of the excitement over the Olympics and the cultural program there. What was the alchemy that made this one work?
I think it was the music center as a venue, the role of Placido, who was called the artistic advisor, I think. But, Los Angeles is a star town, and worthy as the other efforts were, like Los Angeles Opera Repertory, I think it was called, Joanna Dordick's company, was a wonderful company. It was never going to take off because it didn't have any perceived star power. So I think that, and Peter was not blind to that. Hello, David Hockney. Hello, so I think that was a big part of why. And when City Opera came in the void after San Francisco Opera stopped coming, we were in San Francisco then, and every year we would have a meeting with Tom Wachtel and do a budget about touring back to Los Angeles to the Music Center. 3,000 seats, not to the Shrine, 6,000 seats. The economics were dreadful. And also, the megastars weren't going to be doing that. So I think it's the star power and the fact that the Music Center, even in that hugely geographically and otherwise diverse community, is still the center of something.
Right. Now, and it's funny as I grow older into the zone of Peter, when he was a successful general director, he was indefatigable. He would travel and just get off a plane flying from LA to a European city, go to a performance, always with his little small note card and his small little handwriting to himself. Really an incredible energy. I don't know how he did it.
I don't know how he did it either, but because both he and I went to all the performances literally. And in a given year, there were more fundraising events and occasions than performances in the beginning. And he went to all those too. And he just never didn't do whatever it was. And at the same time, he's got a family and 5 children, and they're, going back and forth between the UK and Australia and every other place. He was a remarkable man. And he, that little card that he carried that he wrote with his mechanical pencil, one of the cards in that little folder, he rated every performance he had anything to do with on a scale of 1 to 10 for his whole life. Scottish opera, Sadler's Wells, Scottish opera, LA opera. And he was not kind to himself. He did not give himself a bunch of 10s.
Wow. Wow. So, Patricia, you then went off to the LA Phil, and we're at the Philharmonic for a number of years, and we'll talk about some of the building projects. But I'm kind of curious, after having spent a full 20 years in opera, was going to a symphony very different, somewhat different? How did it feel to go to a symphony after opera?
It's very different. That was now 20 years ago, so it's probably different again. But at that time, the hierarchical nature of a symphony was so contrasted to the collaborative nature of an opera that was a huge shock to me, to my system. But otherwise, a lot of the problems are the same.
Right.
And a lot of the challenges are the same. The music was fantastic.
It's interesting to hear it described as hierarchical versus collaborative, because I'm always very happy that opera feels like the most collaborative of the art forms, related, of course, to the fact that opera itself is a collaboration between words and music. And then you've got stage director and conductor and just the complexity of it.
And dancers and chorus and makeup artists, and you can't do it without all of them.
You are credited with, completing Disney Hall, with the renovation of the Hollywood Bowl. Then, of course, you went over back to Minneapolis-St. Paul and superintended the reconstruction of the Ordway. And when I think about it, you built an opera company, built a symphony hall, built the Hollywood Bowl, or restored the Hollywood Bowl, built a concert hall within the Ordway. What is it about projects that you like so much?
They're fun. I should say Disney Hall. First place, it took longer to build Disney Hall than it took as long as it took to build the model for St. Peter's in Rome. And a lot of people made that possible. And not the least of whom, of course, is Deborah Borda. So let's just be clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
I helped, but I was mostly involved. One of the reasons Deborah asked me to come was, here's the Disney Concert Hall project, and here's the Hollywood Bowl renovation project in parallel. Well, so I mainly concentrated on the bowl.
But again, this question about projects, it is rare that one of our colleagues, essentially built an opera company from the ground up and handled multiple capital projects like the Hollywood Bowl and like in a way, the expansion, rebuilding of the Ordway. Clearly, you have an affinity and a skill set with these massive projects. What makes you go in for more?
Well, you'll observe that after the concert hall was built at the Ordway in St. Paul, I said, that's it. I'm done now. Buildings are us, but I'm done now. Partly because those are long trajectory projects always. And, you get to be years old and you think, do I have the next 10 years trajectory? No, let somebody else do that. Because they are all, without exception, they take way longer than you think they're going to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Cost more than anybody thinks they're going to. But I sure did love it. And the concert hall, I have to say, is a huge, huge addition to the arts life of the cities. It's a beautiful space for music, beautiful.
I've not yet been in the concert hall in the Ordway. And of course, when we're doing our annual conference in May of 2022, I'll look forward to being inside it. But clearly, just they built this wonderful opera theater that was used by the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. But now the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra has its own home within that footprint of the Ordway, a remarkable reconstruction. I wanted to ask you to compare and contrast the impact of leadership in a smaller city like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Ordway being in St. Paul, versus working in LA, just a huge kind of international city. Did you find a different kind of reward being back in a smaller city?
I would say yes, because it is much more possible to really be in community and in various communities than it is in a huge, sprawling megalopolis like LA, which is fascinating in its way. But yeah, I did. I mean, St. Paul is a place where you, like as not, you'll run into the mayor at the hardware store. And you never pass up an opportunity to discuss things with the mayor. So yes, I would say that being able to have that level of engagement and involvement is satisfying on a level that wasn't possible for me in Los Angeles. Now, if you ask Deborah Borda that question, she'd probably say Los Angeles is exactly her right size, or New York.
Mm-hmm.
People are different.
As I read some interviews with you, some profiles, preparing for today's conversation, I read a lot about how collaborative you are, how you're able to build alliances and achieve things through partnership. I also know you as a really strong leader, clear, to the point, no nonsense. And I'm wondering, how do you blend really strong, decisive leadership with a collaborative approach to the projects that you manage? How do you blend those two?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think just because one is maybe perceived as a strong leader, it doesn't mean you don't need partners. Never, as Peter Pastreich famously used to say, others too, real leadership is not the power to compel, it's the power to inspire. So I think having partners is being able to have strong partners is an important part of strong leadership. Because otherwise you're a dictator, and we don't need any more of those.
In your career, were there role models, either role models you knew and talked to, or role models you just thought about, well, imagining what they would do in a particular situation? What about role models?
I've been lucky. I've had a lot of really strong mentors. Kurt Adler was one, certainly. Brad Morrison was one. Although I did not know her very well, I really, really, really admired Artis Kranick, and as a woman in the business. And so I would find myself thinking, I wonder what Artis would do. So she was a role model for me as a woman in opera.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And did you feel disadvantaged through your career by being a woman in opera? What did opera put up barriers intentionally or blindly to your progress as a professional?
I think barriers were mainly unintentional, and they didn't notably stop me. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but you figure out, either go over it or around it or under it or something. It's one reason I think that my language was quite colorful, is because that's not ladylike. And sometimes that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when I was working in those years with Brad Morrison, and we would work on various projects, and you'd be the main person or the secondary person. And one project, I can't remember, was in Sioux City, Iowa, come to think of it. And somebody in this meeting I was leading said, "What does Brad think?" Brad's not in the room. I said, you'll have to ask him, but he's not on this project.
Yeah.
So, people then, hopefully more so than now, but still now, have a tendency to defer to the male over the female. pisses me off, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
And I think it's still the truth.
Artis was board chair at Opera America when I first started here in 1990. And although she passed away at the end of 1996, I still think of her as a role model because of the number of times I think, what would Artis do?
Oh, yeah.
She had such clarity about the principles of honest leadership. I want to take out my Ouija board sometimes and say, what would Artis do?
And such determination and honesty and integrity.
Yeah,
I really, really admired her.
yeah. Have you been a mentor? You talked about being mentored. Do you play the role of mentor either when you were working at various companies or now that you are in the age of retirement?
Not officially, but unofficially, sure. And some people will say that relationship has been important to them in their careers. It's not anything that's intentional. I mean, it's not, I'm going to be a mentor 3 days a week. But if someone, particularly someone young in the profession, wants to know what I think or wants my advice about something, I'm happy to give it.
What is the most common advice you give to people seeking leadership in the arts today?
I think that it's very important to figure out the core of the enterprise that you're looking at and whether it matches up with your own core, whether you can be really singularly devoted to it, because that is what it takes. So I urge people to be clear about their own motive and about whatever the gig is, and not to take something, not necessarily take the one that pays the most money, not necessarily take the one that is the more famous, but to really dig into the opportunity and see if it matches your requirements.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. I think not to just be swayed by what other people think of a given opportunity. Gee, you should take that job because, it's classy, it's famous, you'll be famous. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Will you like it? Will you be good at it? Can you bring something to the table? I think those are really important questions.
Yeah, I along those lines, I will frequently say to someone thinking about a job, if you're thinking about this as a 4 or 5 year step to something else, I don't think it's the right job for you. You have to take the job if you think you would be happy being there for the rest of your career, because then you'll really dig in and do it right, as opposed to just looking at it as a stepping stone.
As a stepping stone to something else. And I think that there's a lot of cynicism in job choice based on that. Like, well, I'll do that because it'll look good on the resume, or, and I just don't think that's good for the person or the institution.
As you look over a number of decades in arts leadership, are there trends today that you watch that please you, that distress you? What are your thoughts about some of the trends, either artistically in the emergence of new work or the challenges of the subscription audience less and less willing to commit to performances in advance? What are the trends that most capture your attention these days?
I think one is the extreme creativity that arose in the pandemic. Shows me that there's life in the old girl yet. And all these, the number of times when a reporter would call doing the annual study about is classical music dead? Well, no, it's not. And the fact that the subscription model has had to change. So it has to change. Things have to change. The thing that I think is most interesting to explore changing is the basic governance structure of arts organizations. And really the whole board structure, does that really work anywhere? So the 501c3 is only the delivery system. It's not the art form. And sometimes I think we don't question ourselves enough about our delivery system.
Mm-hmm.
and whether it could do with a refresher. I think perhaps it could. But I can't figure out what that should be because I'm so mired in the old one that I can't imagine it not being the way it's always been. I think the increasing, not enough, but diversity of artists and composers and hearing more women's music played on the radio, the Met doing Fire Shop in My Bones. Okay, the Met is how many years old? 100 and something. That's their first opera by an African American. Okay, took a while, but it's not going to be the last. Hopefully, it's not going to be the last from Terence Blanchard.
No, they've announced they're doing Champion next, so that's great.
Which they did in St. Louis a couple of years ago, right? So I think the thing about opera, the emotive power of opera, is eternal. And the stories, the impact of the stories, can still be felt. The old stories, even though some of them arguably need to be rethought, and the new stories. But the power of opera is the emotional resonance from the music and the story. And I don't think there's an art form that can touch it for power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't fret about the repertoire. I think the repertoire is continually being refreshed. And a lot of new pieces don't live to see a second performance, nor should they.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, and some will be dug up 20 years from now as undiscovered treasures, which they might have been. Or there might be a reason they've been buried for 20 years. But I think that the creative process on the part of the composers and librettists, I think, is undamaged by all this other stuff, like whether the subscription model has gone to hell or whether the board structure is crazy. Yeah, maybe, but that's just the delivery system.
Yeah.
It's not the art form.
Oh, Patricia, it is so good to speak to you. And this conversation makes me realize how much I miss more regular contact with you and how much we miss you in the field. I mean, I'm so happy that you're well and in a place you love, but I must say we miss you. And
well, I miss you too, and all my colleagues. And I had a wonderful life in opera. I did, and in the arts generally. And I'm just lucky. I'm just one lucky dame, I'll tell you.